Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Tricamarum fought on December the 15th, 533, near Carthage, some 30 kilometers west of it, between the armies of the Byzantine Empire under the Generalissimo Belisarius and the Vandal kingdom, commanded by King Gelimer, the great-grandson of Gaiseric, and his brother Zazo. And this battle followed the one of Ad Decimum that had taken place in mid-September of the same year, and essentially wiped out the Vandal kingdom in the ensuing defeat. Right? I don't want to spoil the final, but I guess that we all know how it all ended. I will essentially read the only source that we have on the topic. This is the only history that narrates it. That is, of course, Procopius' History of the Wars, Book 4, the Vandalic War. That's properly a battle tactics analysis reconstruction video. However, Procopius is really our sole source, and so, like in many cases, for medieval warfare, we just rely on a single account and or just on very few information. In this case, actually, Procopius, as you know, is quite, verbose, sounds like a criticism to his work, really not. But of course, there is a lot written on the context, on the battle itself. That, however, as it also is really normal, if you look at the art of war in general, seems to have been a pretty simple engagement, right? As von Clausewitz says, war is actually simple. It's much simpler than what people think. If anything, people tend to overcomplicate the military historical explanation for no good reason. The point of war, however, is that it's hard, right? Like all things, they are actually simple, but they're hard. And I say this because, as you will see, the battle gets down to a sort of muscle to muscle as far as, say, the crossing of the river between the two armies for, as we will see now, a different, in fact, strategy that the two armies were pursuing against one another. And therefore, I think it's better to comment everything, all the sort of question marks of all the things that we do not know in spite of the good information, thanks to this piece of Byzantine literature, because it's only at the end you can evaluate, like, basically this pretty lengthy text, mostly, as you see, also occupied by speeches to the troops before the battle. There is all, again, a Byzantine mindset that we can't even explain it for in this video, only at least. It's something we addressed in many other circumstances, and that, of course, makes you wonder about also the veridicity of the same. Not that Procopius is, say, an unreliable source, but in general, of course, we do know specifically that some commanders were, for example, treated with a bit more favor, even though we know that they sort of ended up badly, also back in Constantinople for their as a consequence of their misdeeds also in this Western theaters. There is a general, say, technical dimension of what these armies would have been like and how they were, by whom they were composed. So all things we can reflect a bit at the end, mostly because of the hypothesis that we can make without really knowing more than what, in fact, literally Procopius tells us. So before any other consideration, let's just read. So Gadamer, seeing all the Vandals gathered together, led his army against Carthage. And so essentially the Romans here, the result, the antifact, let's say, had landed in Africa, and Belisarius entered Carthage. He even spent the time in the Saint Gelimer's palace that he had abandoned, being served by his own slaves, as a matter of fact. So it's a context in which the Vandals have already essentially given the initiative to the Romans initially, and they have retreated into the Libyan hinterland, as a matter of fact, because as you know, the Vandalic kingdom was significantly extended. If anything, we will look at say the maybe at this broader war against the Vandals in a video about its strategy and politics only. This is evidently not the case, because there were other important engagements, as we've seen at Decimum, that had already brought the Vandals to essentially make a step back, and there were actually other engagements. So later in just the future of Byzantine Africa is historically interesting, but again, not for today. Here we're just to reconstruct the Battle of Tricamarum and going with that. So Gelimer, seeing all the Vandals gathered together, led his army against Carthage, and when they came close to it, they tore down a portion of the aqueduct, a structure well worth seeing, which conducted water into the city. And after encamping for a time, they withdrew, since no one of the enemy came out against them. And going about the country, there they kept the roads under guard, and thought that in this way they were besieging Carthage. However, they did not gather any booty nor plundered the land, but took possession of it as their own. And at the same time they kept hoping that there would be some treason on the part of the Carthaginians themselves and such of the Roman soldiers as followed the doctrine of Arius. This is interesting, of course the Vandals were largely Arian, and there were some Arians within the Byzantine ranks themselves. That's why, say, the general background, the composition of the forces is quite interesting, but there is more information now that will also clarify it. The Vandals, also sent to the leaders of the Huns, and promising, the Huns in the Byzantine army, and promising that they would have many good things from the Vandals, entreated them to become their friends and allies. Now, the Huns, even before this, had not been well disposed towards the cause of the Romans, since they had not indeed come to them willingly as allies, for they asserted that the Roman general Peter had given an oath, and then, disregarding what had been sworn, had thus brought them to Byzantium. And accordingly, they received the words of the Vandals and promised that when they should come to real fighting, they would turn with them against the Roman army. Now, as we will see, there is actually a point about the Huns during this battle, because they're put a bit aside of the rest of the deployment. Should be considered by the Byzantines against the Vandals. Should be considered that at the Battle of Decimum, the Huns had actually paid a substantial tribute of blood for the Romans. They had an important role, and we will see it in a video about that battle. So their forces, their numbers would have been depleted. And so here we don't even know too clearly why Procopius is saying that they weren't so loyal to the Romans. It's possible, right? They had some quarrel with the Byzantines in general, but hey, they were there, they were in their army, and let's say we're not going to digress on the process of how so many foreign mercenaries were used by the Byzantines, especially at this point in history, in their army, and how the Huns were still around. And yes, in a sense, it's just like the Germans. I mean, you could find them from all sides, right? There were surely some Vandal soldiers with Vandalic ancestry within the Byzantine ranks, that the army that landed in Africa with Belisarius. So these peoples, their war bands were very well globe-trotters, and so that's interesting to appreciate. We'll do it hopefully in another video. In any case, we take note of this sort of apparent treachery of the Huns, right? This sort of double sign, albeit staying in the Byzantine army. But Belisarius had a suspicion of all this, for he had heard it from the deserters of the Vandals, right? And also the circuit wall had not as yet been completed entirely, and for these reasons he did not think it possible for his men to go out again the enemy for the present, but he was making his preparations within as well as possible. And one of the Carthaginians, Laurus by name, having condemned on a charge of treason and proved guilty by his own secretary, was impaled by Belisarius on a hill before the city. And as a result of this, the others came to feel sort of irresistible fear and refrained from attempts at treason. And he courted the Massagetai. Massagetai are the Huns in this context. The Byzantines called the peoples of their times after the name of the ones that inhabited the respective area of geographical area of origin, right? So it's just like, I don't know, the Franks would be the Celts, the Gauls, et simile, but it's just, Byzantine ethnographic classicism. He courted the Huns thus with gifts and banquets and every other manner of flattering attention every day, and thus persuaded them to disclose to him what Gelimer had promised them on condition of their turning traitors in battle. And these barbarians said that they had no enthusiasm for fighting, for they feared that if the Vandals were vanquished, the Romans would not send them back to their native land, but they would be compelled to grow old and die right there in Libya. And besides, they were also concerned, they said, about the booty, lest they be robbed of it. This is interesting because it shows how it did happen that many, Roman garrisons would be made sometimes of the souls, sometimes even of the defeated enemies that were already there, right? And this is sort of the concern of the Huns that were also there. They were in for the loot, for the general sacking that this nomadic peoples were mostly into. But and so it can be realistic. It can be realistic as far as indeed the Romans would use some of these mercenaries, would deport some of their war prisoners in faraway places, using them as garrisons, or just like soldiers that were coerced into by the other units during those same campaigns to be brought elsewhere. It can be a thing. Then indeed Belisarius gave them pledges that if the Vandals should be conquered decisively, they would be sent without the least delay to their homes with all their booty, and thus he bound them by oaths in very truth to assist the Romans with all zeal in carrying through the war. Naturally, in such multi-ethnic army like the Byzantine one of this period in particular is, different peoples had sort of different customs. The Huns wanted to bring the loot home, whereas in general, like even among the Germans, etc., it was a matter of at least a criterion in the order of distribution. And so, of course, this passed through the ranks of the army in this case, the Roman one, so that the Huns could have not, in theory, done whatever they wanted. But Belisarius tries to buy these guys out, to befriend them, to socialize with them, so to show them that they weren't just sort of slaves sent to war. And when all things had been prepared by Belisarius in the best way possible, and the circuit wall had been already completed, he called together the whole army and spoke as follows: As for exhortation, fellow Romans, I do not know that it is necessary to make any to you, men who have recently conquered the enemy so completely that Carthage here and the whole of Libya is a possession of your valor. And for this reason you will have no need of admonition that prompts to daring, for the spirits of those who have conquered are by no means wont to be overcome. But I think it not untimely to remind you of this one thing, that if you on the present occasion but prove equal to your own selves in valor, straightway there will be an end for the Vandals of their hopes, and for you of the battle. Hence there is every reason why you should enter into this engagement with the greatest eagerness, for ever sweet to man is toil coming to an end and reaching its close. Now as for the host of the Vandals, let no one of you consider them, for not by numbers of men nor by measure of body, but by valor of soul is war wont to be decided. Right? This is typical, say, the Byzantines had sclerotized a bit the idea that it's purely about the soul, and so as if the body did not count. This was an old idea, of course, that the Romans were morally superior, and even if the barbarians were bigger, it's picked like in Indo-European mythology that, you know, the heroes fight against the giants and whatever, but those are dumber and whatever. However, the Byzantines had gone a bit too far, because the Greeks had historically gone. The Romans in, say, the West had thought in a slightly different way, but it can be applied, and this, of course, shows the stereotype of the German is bigger. And so the Vandals are treated as, again, the barbarian. That also, as far as those physical characteristics, surely were a thing. I made a video about the Vandals. I made one about the Vandal sack of Rome. In one of the very first videos I made in Schwerpunkt, one of the big ones was, in fact, about the Vandals. But I think that either I will make a new one, or perhaps, I don't know, re-upload that, whatever. In any case, they are important people. We have to talk about them a bit more often. Now, here, excuse me, I lost a little bit. Yes, for I know well that terror and the memory of misfortunes have laid hold upon the enemy and compelled them to become less brave, for the one fills them with fear because of what has already happened, and the other brushes aside their hope of success. For fortune, once seen to be bad, straightway enslaves the spirit of those who have fallen in her way, and I shall explain how the struggle involves for you at the present time a greater stake than formerly. For in the former battle, the danger was, if things did not go well for us, that we should not take the land of others. But now, if we do not win the struggle, we shall lose the land which is our own. In proportion, then, as it is easier to possess nothing than to be deprived of what one has, just so now our fear touches our most vital concerns more than before. That's why I said that Procopius is verbose, because of course we want action, but this was very important in, say, Byzantine rhetoric, and, you know, forming this sort of eloquent that, of course, sort of shows like some archetypal ideas of principles of valor, of moral superiority, etc. And yet formerly we had, he goes on, the fortune to win the victory with the infantry absent, but now, yes, that's, I think we will see at Decimum now instead, that there is infantry. But now, entering the battle with God propitious and with our whole army, I have hopes of capturing the camp of the enemy, men and all. Thus then, having the end of the war ready at hand, do not, by reason of any negligence, put it off to another time, lest you be compelled to seek for the opportune moment after it has run past us. For when the fortune of war is postponed, its nature is not to proceed in the same manner as before, especially if the war be prolonged by the will of those who are carrying it on. For heaven is accustomed to bring retribution always upon those who abandon the good fortune which is present. But if anyone considers that the enemy, seeing their children and wives and most precious possessions in our hands, will be daring beyond reason and will incur risks beyond the strength which they have, he does not think rightly. For an overpowering passion springing up in the heart in behalf of what is most precious is wont to diminish men's actual strength, and does not allow them to make full use of their present opportunities. Considering then all these things, it behooves you to go with great content against the enemy. After such words of exhortation, Belisarius sent out all the horsemen on the same day, except 500, and also the guardsmen and the standard, which the Romans called bandum, right? And this is essentially the vexillum praetorium carried by the cavalry of the imperial guard, also equivalent to, entrusting them to John the Armenian, and directing him to skirmish only if opportunity should arise. This was important operationally. Of course, there were skirmishes during the march, the movements, and you had to know what was out there and having some sort of vanguard that was ready to engage in case, right? It was necessary or advantageous at least. And he, so Belisarius himself, on the following day, followed with infantry forces and the 500 horsemen of his own. That would actually be, as you see also from the map, like his own force in battle. And the Massagetes, so the Huns, deliberating among themselves, decided, in order to seem in friendly agreement with both Gelimer and Belisarius, neither to begin fighting for the Romans, nor to go over to the Vandals before the encounter, but whenever the situation of one or the other army should be bad, then join the victors in their pursuit of the vanquished. Right? Thus then had this matter been decided upon by the barbarians. This is interesting because if you look at the general background of the Hunnic warfare and sort of as we'll see now, what kind of role they would have in this encounter, like they would have made an excellent flanking force. As a matter of fact, especially if they had been depleted numerically, they could still perform, given their equestrian skills, that important sort of turn around the enemy army and attack it from the flank, especially as we will see now, tactically situations seem to be a deadlock. But here rather see, at least Procopius tells us that this is at least all we know regarding this Hunnic behavior as a bit treacherous. And the Roman army came upon the Vandals and camped in Tricamarum, 150 states distant from Carthage. So they both bivouacked there at a considerable distance from one another. So of course they had set camps adequately, let's say, distant to eventually face one another. As we'll see now, there wasn't too much of a, pressure from both sides to actually engage. So this will be turned. This will turn out during engagement that none of the sides wanted really to sort of try crossing. If anything, because there was a river in between. Not much, because of course the strategic pressure was there, but everybody was very cautious. Also because the forces were sort of equivalent, so it was a kind of a, as we'll see now, quite calibrated battle at the beginning, sort of ballet. And when it was well on in the night, a prodigy came to pass in the Roman camp as follows. The tips of their spears were lighted with a bright fire, and the points of them seemed to be burning most vigorously. This was not seen by many, but it filled with consternation the few who did see it, not knowing how it would come out. And this happened to the Romans in Italy. Again, at a much later time, this refers to the Goths. So we will read that example. We'll talk about the Italian campaign of Belisarius. And at that time, since they knew by experience, Procopius says, they believed it to be a sign of victory. But now, as I have said, since this was the first time it had happened, they were filled with consternation and passed the night in great fear. And proof note, some traditional thinking, just imagine such power manifest, and it's also a bit realistic that they wouldn't take it as a good omen to begin with, but in any case. And on the following day, Gelimer commanded the Vandals to place the women and children and all their possessions in the middle of the stockade, although it had not the character of a fort, and calling all together, he spoke as follows. It is not to gain glory or to retrieve the loss of empire alone, all fellow Vandals, that we are about to fight, so that even if we willfully played the coward and sacrificed these our belongings, we might possibly live, sitting at home and keeping our own possessions. But you see, surely that our fortunes have come around to such a pass that if we do not gain the mastery over the enemy, we shall, if we perish, leave them as masters of these our children, and our wives, and our land, and all our possessions, while if we survive, there will be added our own enslavement, and to behold all these enslaved. But if indeed we overcome our foes in the war, we shall, if we live, pass our lives among all good things, or after the glorious ending of our lives, there will be left to our wives and children the blessings of prosperity, while the name of the Vandals will survive and their empire be preserved. So that we're fighting essentially to from annihilation to avoid annihilation, and this is really what would happen. It's in a broader political sense. Gelimer goes on, says, for if it has ever happened to any man to be engaged in a struggle for their all, we now more than all others realize that we are entering the battle line with our hopes for all we have resting wholly upon ourselves. Not for our bodies, then, is our fear, nor in death is our danger, but in being defeated by the enemy. For if we lose the victory, that will be to our advantage. Since therefore the case stands so, let no one of the Vandals weaken, but let him proudly expose his body, and from shame at the evils that follow defeat, let him court at the end of life. For when a man is ashamed of that which is shameful, there is always present with him a dauntless courage in the face of danger. And let no recollection of the earlier battle come into your minds, for it was not by cowardice on our part that we were defeated, but we tripped upon obstacles interposed by fortune and were overthrown. Now it is not the way of the tide of fortune to flow always in the same direction, but every day, as a rule, it is wont to change about. In manliness, it is our boast that we surpass the enemy, and that in numbers we're much superior. And this is important because, as we'll see now, that the estimates, at least that we have of the battle, speak of something like 20, some say 25,000 Vandals. I think there weren't that many unless, and we should talk about the Moors as a matter of fact, because, and I'll explain now the reason. The Romans were also something similar, like 15,000. There's really one change about in manliness, okay. And why shall I add that many and great are the incentives which now especially urge us on to valor, naming the glory of our ancestors and the empire which has been handed down to us by them. For in our case, that glory is obscured by our unlikeliness to our kindred, while the empire is bent upon fleeing from us as unworthy. This is a pretty traditional concept of imperium, as you understand, written by a Roman source, but referring to, of course, how the Germans saw this. We talked about this quite recently, as a matter of fact. And I pass over in silence the wails of these poor women and the tears of our children, by which, as you see, I am now so deeply moved that I am unable to prolong my discourse. But having said this one thing, I shall stop, that there will be for us no returning to these most precious possessions if we do not gain the mastery of over the enemy. Remembering these things, shew yourselves brave men, and do not bring shame upon the fame of Gizeric. This is Gizeric, right? The founder of the Vandalic kingdom of Africa. After speaking such words, Gelimer commanded his brother Tzazon to deliver an exhortation separately to the Vandals who had come with him from Sardinia. These were some veterans that had basically retaken Sardinia. That was initially a Vandalic possession. When the kingdom was formed by revolts, they captured Caloris and they slaughtered the locals that had supported the Byzantine reconquest. And he gathered them together a little apart from the camp and spoke as follows. This is Gelimer's brother. For all the Vandals, fellow soldiers, the struggle is in behalf of those things which you have just heard the king recount. But for you, in addition to all the other considerations, it so happens that you are vying with yourselves, for you have recently been victorious in a struggle for the maintenance of our rule, and you have recovered the island for the empire of the Vandals. There is every reason, therefore, for you to make still greater display of your valor, for those whose hazard involves the greatest things must needs display the greatest zeal for warfare also. Indeed, when men who struggle for the maintenance of their rule are defeated, should it so happen they have not failed in the most vital part, but when men are engaged in battle for their all, surely their very lives are influenced by the outcome of the struggle. And for the rest, if you shew yourself brave men at the present time, you will thereby prove with certainty that the destruction of the tyrant goddess, this was the leader of the Caloris stronghold in Sardinia that they had killed, was an achievement of valor on your part. But if you weaken now, you will be deprived of even the renown of those deeds as of something which does not belong to you at all. And yet, even apart from this, it is reasonable to think that you will have an advantage over the rest of the Vandals in this battle, for those who have failed are dismayed by their previous fortune, while those who have encountered no reverse enter the struggle with their courage unimpaired. And this too, I think, will not be spoken out of season, that if we conquer the enemy, it will be you who will win the credit for the greatest part of the victory, and all will call you saviors of the nation of the Vandals. For men who achieve renown in company with those who have previously met with misfortune naturally claim the better fortune as their own. Considering all these things, therefore, I say that you should bid the women and children who are lamenting their fate to take courage even now, should summon God to fight with us, should go with enthusiasm against the enemy, and lead the way for our compatriots into this battle. After both Gelimer and Sazan had spoken such exhortations, they led out the Vandals, and at about the time of lunch, when the battle began at noon, when the Romans were not expecting them, but were preparing their meal, they were at hand, and arrayed themselves for battle along the bank of the stream. Now the stream at that place in an ever-flowing one, to be sure, but its volume is so small that it is not even given a special name by inhabitants of the place, but it is designated simply as a brook, right? So again, it's not a major obstacle, yet tactically speaking, of course, it does provide an advantage defensively. So as we'll see now, the battle will revolve around this attempt of crossing from both, mostly from the Roman side. Mostly they were luring the Vandals into crossing, and they don't actually do it. They end up essentially clashing into the brook. So continuing, the Romans came to the other bank of this river after preparing themselves as well as they could under the circumstances, and arrayed themselves as follows. The left wing was held by Martinus and Valerian, John, Cyprian, Alpheus, and Marcellus, and as many others as were commanders of the Federati. Now you can have, like, the map I prepared is quite simple, but it sort of tells everything that we know for sure, and so as we will see now, most of the rest the information is sparse. And the right was held by Pappas, Barbatus, and Aigan, and the others who commanded the forces of cavalry, generic mounted force, and you can of course distinguish like what is cavalry from infantry from the bar and the full color, of course, in the picture. And in the center, John took his position. These were, of course, Byzantine leaders. Some of the names, if you understand, are sort of a bit exotic. They were barbarians themselves. Symmachoi, as the Byzantines called them, at least in Greek. Then that was the equivalent of Federati. That was the same, of course, in Latin. So in the center, John took his position, leading the guards and spearmen of Belisarius and carrying the general's standard. This is interesting because it shows that maybe there was some kind of disguise. This did happen sometimes, but as we will see, Belisarius fights next to him. In fact, next to his with his unit of 500 men detached apparently from this commanded by John. It has again the general standard, the guards, sort of the heaviest troops as we can understand. The famed Clibanari. Right, we'll talk about all these forces in our Byzantine army, serious historical units, etc. Belisarius also came there at the opportune moment with his 500 horsemen, leaving the infantry behind, advancing at a walk. For all the Huns had, so it does seem that, as we'll see now, that also the infantry was just supporting cavalry more than anything. We'll explain now what the Vandals were doing from their side. For all the Huns had been arrayed in another place, it being customary for them, even before this, not to mingle with the Roman army if they could avoid so doing, and at that time especially, since they had in mind a purpose which has previously been explained. It was not their wish to be arrayed with the rest of the army. So basically, so you see also in the map, like there is a general battle line. Here the distances between the various units on the main line do not have to be taken to literally, like actually should, because here I'm using a map that I can still change, before I upload the video. But definitely, as you see, for sure the Huns are on the left. I decided to place them there as but detached. This is the most important thing that we get from Procopius, as you've just heard, because they didn't use to mingle with the Romans. They fought by themselves. Let's say Procopius again is a reliable source in general, but we don't have to think it's extremely precise, or he even wants to be. Like, it's just telling a story, and so here the Huns were treacherous, and that's the point. But as he said himself, the Huns would sort of tend to behave like this, even when they hadn't this such purposes. I would say that, of course, like the Huns would have been arrayed tendentially in looking at also like how other peoples of the steppes were used in other armies in other times, compared especially to the heavier cavalry, the more sedentary people. So of course in some substantially different fashion, right? Of course the Huns would have their own heavy horsemen themselves, but they would probably have horse archers. So their role could be, let's say, either, I don't know, opening the engagement, the skirmishers, let's say, in very in-depth formations, or they could indeed be placed in this sort of, say, flank position that, of course, opens to, as I was saying before, the possibility that they would have actually been designed arrayed, like in that position, to attack the enemy from the flank, had they, for example, crossed the river in this case. We do not have an evidence of this, but I think it's plausible also because, you see, the source says these things, but it's not like we literally know what was spoken at the command. Here we just have, for the sake of the story, Belisarius that familiarizes with the Huns because he thought that they were not reliable, but in a strictly military sense, this is an army. It's commanded by the Byzantines. There are some specifics here for which there are also other barbarians fighting an imperial army, and the Huns would have sort of followed, so they would have not been so radically separated from the Romans for whichever reason. And the idea is that if you plan to, let's say, here we don't know too much about the battlefield indeed, but we understand it was sort of complex, but let's say if especially these guys are placed somewhere else and they are therefore, as we understand here, not really part of the main battle line, it would have been at least discussed, the possibility of attacking the enemy from the flank, right, from a detached position that the enemy would not see, and especially as a task that suited perfectly the Huns, right? When you attack someone from the flank, it's not much about the numbers or the heaviness of this force. You just need some troops, and yes, some have to be elite to a degree. They must have a great coup d'oeil, determining the right moment in which to attack when the enemy is fully engaged against your lines. But just a mere flank attack is that dangerous. So especially here when the enemy is committed to the crossing or against say, while the enemy from the other side is battling them on the same riverbed, an attack from the flank really makes things a bit more difficult. And we do not know, as we will see now, much more about the distances or anything that we can reconstruct, unfortunately. Here we're told that this stream doesn't even have a name because it can't even practically be recognized. It wasn't a big deal. But it's important to understand how the battlefield was structured, so in case any sort of opportunity could arise to enact some interesting tactic. Again, the Huns would have been perfect for such flank attack, but this is just the first thing. I must say I have a thing for flank attacks. I even wrote an article on that, but say, at least in another circumstance. So going on, such then was the formation of the Romans. It's not very complicated formation. Cavalry in the front, infantry in the rear, again, simplicity. The idea in this 6th century is that cavalry is taking over, definitely, the battlefields. Especially in the second half of the 6th century, you see that the infantry as the queen of battles in late antiquity is surpassed in importance by cavalry. Infantry is still very important. Most of these horsemen themselves dismount very often. This is clear from Byzantine military manuals. We hear from the strategic and also about the blonde-haired peoples, like the Vandals would have been counted doing the same. Very often I made some videos about that. But the cavalry superiority is clear, and in this case, we're still in the first half of the 6th century, is particularly evident in these engagements. At that moment, as we've seen, just cavalry had been fighting substantially, and of course the Vandals had received a substantial, that they had for example, integrated parts of the Alans. They hadn't gone so far east as the Goths, but they just had, by putting themselves in motion, gather all these Iranian elements. The Vandals themselves were essentially a Germano-Slavo-Celtic people in the essentials of their ethnogenesis, and they are considered as East Germans not just in a sort of linguistic sense, but also because they would have been sort of more influenced by these Easterners. However, here I will not make a story of the Vandals, what they could have gotten also by some, Iberian, equestrian influence that would have been a thing. Mostly the Alans had been the other people they had shared most of their conquests, time being issues among them. The Byzantines themselves now are coming mostly from a Pontic dimension, also an Levantine one, in which you have from one side these peoples like the Huns and the Sasanians. So naturally they have integrated many of these forces in these peoples in their armies as recruits. Some are settled within the empire and levied for military service and so on. So in this case, mostly we'll see better the Byzantine army of the time of Belisarius, the time of Justinian, being very ethnically composite. Like, there is a bulk of Roman forces that even bear the name from legions dating back to, the time of Caesar or Augustus. But next to them, first of all, they're very fragmented because there are many new ones, and these units all had sort of a different history. The best sort of base you can trace that those forces is the Notizia Dignitatum, that is likely before this time, and yet what you have also in large number was these foreigners, right? And in many, probably again in the largest amount of cultural diversity you can find at any point in the Byzantine army. Because it's not like there wouldn't be foreigners later, but of this variety, like in Justinian times, in this greater re-expansion of the empire, and at the end of the migration era, so where all these peoples had moved around, is not to be found, nor before nor after, historically. And so there would be really, you find this everywhere. You find it among the Arabs, you find it among the Moors that we'll discuss now, you find it among the Germans. Everybody gets on horseback more often than it had been the case. Because raiding warfare increases, there are all these peoples from the steppes that basically swarm everywhere, and that is just obvious. But it's also a matter of social stratification, general decay, the fact that now just a few people could afford just to fight out there. This is a period of very intense material poverty, as telling the truth, as well. In Italy, the army of Belisarius will have to use for, say, a wooden armor for knights, because metal was just sort of so rare, now becomes so expensive and even difficult to find proper. So consider this aspect. Also, these forces are not immense, as you understand. These are robust forces, but as you understand, they don't surpass a couple of tens of thousands. Let's pass to the Vandal array. You can already see in the map, of course. So, and on the side of the Vandals, Procopius says, either wing was held by the Chiliarchs. These were approximations. I do not tell much about the organics. These were, as you know, terms from the Hellenistic armies. They counted, in this case, 1,000 soldiers under their command. The Chiliarchs were this force 1,500 sometimes. Naturally, these forces are normally under strength, chronically so it doesn't matter to make the maths. The point is that here the Vandals, of course, followed a sort of still tribal, clanic organization, clienterally speaking. Militarily, they fought under their leaders, their chieftains, and it was all a hierarchy in that sense. Naturally, the Vandals themselves had been strongly Romanized. Africa in late antiquity was one of the most radically developed and Romanized parts of the empire. We're talking specifically today's Tunisia. Without mentioning, as we'll see now, also the Berber influence on Vandalic warfare, because the auxiliaries were also, of course, native Berbers. Or at least like the word Romans in a sedentary reality, but they were mixed with the sort of local, have been the Punic world, and then you had this warbanders from the hinterland that were well expandables as in war bands, as mercenaries, etc. That were also, I made a video about the Battle of Mammes, where you see the Byzantines fighting against the Moors, showing their tactics are quite interesting. But let's read this Vandal array. The Chiliarchs, each one led by the division under him, while in the center was Tzazon, the brother of Gelimer, and behind him were arrayed the Moors. Now, I found some very recent reconstructions of this battle for preparing for this video, and I noticed that they do not show the Moors on the battlefield, whereas Procopius, as we just read, actually tells of their presence, and specifically says that they would sort of in a position makes a lot of sense behind the center, behind actually the Sardinian Vandal veterans, and therefore like a second line basically, because when you see here they'll say behind them were arrayed, like we're talking about different battle lines. It's not like, I don't know, the same line. We're talking about the Vandals with the Moors behind. We should actually, like, as, I don't know, retinues, we should, however, sort of tackle a bit this question, because as we will see now, we don't hear about the Moors anymore during the battle. So admittedly, again, the engagement is in Procopius between the Byzantine and the Vandal cavalries. Infantries are present. The Moors, by the way, would have typically fought at this point with some cavalry and some infantry. Infantry was prevalent, but cavalry was also, as we said before, increasing among them as well. They had camel troops as well. The Romans had introduced the animal in North Africa, as a matter of fact. But they were good skirmishers, as you know, some of the finest riders out there. So they would have actually been useful, especially in this battle, arrayed in the front of the Vandal force to skirmish, to wear out the Byzantine heavier cavalry, so that the fresher, heavier Vandal horsemen could actually attack the Byzantines while crossing. But the problem was perhaps exactly this, that the Vandals did not want to, first of all, like being the second to the Moors, like they considered them, as inferiors for many reasons, and in general, so it's not just that it would have been less honorable to fight against the Byzantine that way, but they thought that the Moors would have not stood their ground as lighter cavalry against the fine Byzantine heavy cavalry, and that this could have actually also caused some sort of disorder, right? Seeing the same Moors fleeing, imagine all the dust, etc., that, and having the Byzantines just simply going against you and having basically lost from the Vandal side the advantage of this, the defensive advantage that this stream gave as a wall at a small unit attack would have sort of helped them against the Romans. Well, this likely was not, is the reason why the Moors were arrayed behind. But in this way, there wasn't perhaps like a great deal of also mutual support. As you see, the Byzantines are not even relying particularly on their infantry. We do not know whether in this battle actually both the second lines would have intervened in a way or another. We will see now also that probably since the Vandal cavalry broke, the Moors did themselves. So maybe the Moors were not even that committed to the Vandal cause to begin with, a bit like the Huns weren't for the Romans, as Procopius points out. In any case, there could have been some sort of layer, like hopeful second line of defense, like they would have brought them into battle. Also, a bit for the same reason why the Huns were there looting, right? And maybe, I don't know, there was something similar between the Romans and the Moors in terms of trying to betray the Vandals in this case. And there are lots of instances in which you see the Vandals, for example, before this battle, asking the local Berbers to bring the heads of Roman soldiers, of those scouts that were caught out there, and it turns out the Berbers start killing servants and slaves just to receive the money that the Vandals had promised them when they would bring the heads as a confirmation they had killed someone. So the idea is that there isn't such a great union. Like, as you know, the Vandal kingdom also fell pretty easily overall. Like the Roman military at this point, also thanks to the picture that Procopius made of them, like stands out as very advanced compared to these barbarians. Naturally, in my opinion, things were much more closely fought than to think, but there is no doubt that it was a success after another. So definitely there was such a gap to an extent, but it would have been mostly a political issue, and perhaps the Vandals and the Moors did not get along too well. But we pointed out, and I decided to insert it in the video, the fact that the Moors are behind. So let's go on with Procopius. But Gadamer himself was going about everywhere exhorting them and urging them on to daring, and the command had been previously given to all the Vandals to use neither spear nor any other weapons in this engagement except their swords. This was interpreted at times as if the Vandals were not going, I don't know, these are the kind of strange technicistic, mechanicistic explanations that Byzantine sources give sometimes, and this shows you in practice how sort of, say again, not necessarily unreliable these accounts are, but here the best thing I can think of is that if the Byzantines were to grab, or let's say if the Vandals were waiting for the Byzantines to cross the river, and the Vandals were anxious just to prove, I don't know, some sort of superiority to hand-to-hand combat, skipping, however, inexplicably the shock force that a spearman can, a lancer essentially can perform in a charge like it. That's not really clear what it meant, especially considering that the Vandals surely had very good cavalry, at least among their in the chieftains' retinues, as we've seen, there were the Alans among them were ranked as the best knights ever. Made videos about them, especially their settlement in gold, but not only. So, yeah, it's possible. I don't know, the idea that the Byzantines cross are a bit, daring, and these guys arrive just with these swords. They want to just wrestle with them physically rather than smash it, but doesn't make much sense. I don't know here, honestly, what nobody really knows what Procopius really meant. Or maybe it's just a rhetorical idea that was not even applied to begin with. Or here, again, all the speeches of Gelimer, etc., do think that actually Procopius had the text of that. Or sure, he may have even talked with some of these people, telling what Gelimer wanted or said, or etc. But let's be honest, this is more like sort of a Byzantine style, writing, storytelling, or more than else, an embellishment, heroicization, if you want. But let's go on with it. After a considerable time had passed and no one began the battle, this thing is already telling, because it shows that none of the two sides, as said before, was particularly committed. Like, of course, here the Byzantines were strategically on the offensive. There was no reason why the Vandals here would simply need to cross the river. The Byzantines had gone against the Vandals, and so they wanted for battle. They would have had to attack in the first place. Here, what the Vandals do is to draw up for whichever reason behind the river and standing there. You see, the Romans were taken by surprise because they were apparently having lunch, but they had to hurry and get there. And so, for whichever reason, there is no huge commitment from either side. However, it is, Procopius tells us, John that chooses out a few of those under him. So here we're talking about the Byzantine center, by the advice of Belisarius. By the way, you understand here where the battle line is. It's essentially here, aside from how I represented it, it's also, especially from the Vandal side, it's clear, like you have a center and wings, pretty normal for a single battle line. It is time in history where, again, things were not particularly, armies were not enormous, like there wasn't even this huge social stratification yet, so as a consequence, the type of soldiers and the general distribution of forces was sort of simpler. So John chose out a few of those soldiers, him by the advice of Belisarius, and crossing the river made an attack on the center of the Vandal line, where Zazen crowded them back and gave chase. Right, so basically Byzantines try with a few soldiers to cross the river, see what happens, to lure the Vandals from this other side, which may suggest actually the Byzantines were maybe toying with the idea of a flank attack or something, even though this was just the center. So the point was to commit the entire battle line as a whole, because yes, here we're talking about an important amount of forces, and yes, the center was the most important part, as we will see, so that when that collapsed, the entire thing collapsed. But ideally, like, the wings would be there for very specific, solid reason, not just for showing off. And when all forces are committed, at least from one side, the other has to respond in that fashion, alike. So the Romans in flight came into their own camp. So it seems here what happens that the Byzantines try to lure the Vandals into the Byzantine camp. At least they flee so much back that we think that this wasn't just like a specific route, but maybe a so-called feigned flight. The issue with this in general is that feigned flights are very often starting from real flights. Of course, if the Byzantines had won in the center, they would have done something more of it. But since they were fleeing, the idea was perhaps a pre-orderly thing, like flee until really the camp, so that maybe we managed to lure the Vandals there. Now, the point is, if this was just an element of the Byzantine center, how could these people truly collapse? Like, if it was, of course, a section of the line, say, I mean, how could the Vandals simply chase them? If it was a section, a large enough section of the line, maybe. But here it sounds like something that we can't really reconstruct in the details, because we're not provided with adequate evidence concerning rather the attempt again of the Byzantines to lure the Vandals out as a wall force towards their own camp, so that they could destabilize and attack them or whatever. They knew also that the enemy, say the flower of the Vandals, was there. And so this thing apparently goes on, because Procopius says, and once, for 3 times, once more John, leading out more of the guardsmen of Belisarius, made a dash against the forces of Tzazan, and again, being repulsed from there, withdrew to the Roman camp. All right. So again, it's unlikely that, especially these elite forces, would have simply been wasted for, some feint flight. Maybe, yes, they had the training to simulate better one, but of course they would have been spent to cross the stream that, as we've seen, wasn't even this huge of a barrier, and try to actually break the Vandalic lines. And so, again, and a third time, with almost all the guards and spearmen of Belisarius, he took the general standard and made his attack with much shouting and a great noise. So here, actually, the situation is not easy for the Byzantines, because they are committing the very best center against the Vandals that have already repelled them twice. So they were, of course, testing the consistency of their lines. Here we have to think also of a lot of horse archery involved, especially from the Byzantine side, to actually soften the enemy ranks up and try to commit as many Vandals as possible. And here, see, beyond this, behind this center, there is really not much else, as we've seen. For the Byzantine side, you have the infantry. For the Vandal side, you have the Moors. And so you can argue that the battle sort of revolves around this. It's also relevant that, as we've seen, Belisarius was actually separated from John's forces, even from his own same personal banner, as a general, a commander-in-chief, probably because this sort of gradual trying to sort of breakthrough had been planned in some way. But it is still a desperate situation. If the Byzantines don't break through, things can turn out pretty badly for them. And so here John attacks, and with all the best of his forces, the wall won. But since the barbarians manfully withstood them, Procopius says, and used only their swords, the battle became fierce, and many of the noblest of the Vandals fell, and among them Tzazan himself, the brother of Gelimer. Tzazan is killed in combat during this larger engagement. Procopius insists again on this fact that the Vandals simply passed to the swords, nothing else. Again, why should have not simply charged the Romans with their spears, especially as they were crossing the river? Nobody really gets it. Also because they would normally fight with a spear, right? So the sword is a secondary weapon, but still, of course, very important. But made a bit about the Germanic swords of this time, how relevant they were, what kind of real pieces of art really they were. Like Byzantine Germanic swords were among the finest, basically. That it was a clash between elite here. Like the Byzantines had say their own heavier cavalry, say segmented out in an aristocratic sense themselves. So here the Vandals are using their elite as spearhead. You see Tzazan that falls in combat, and that's actually what seems to settle the whole matter, right? Tzazan dies, and at this point the Romans move full in with all their force. Procopius says, then at last the whole Roman army was set in motion, and crossing the river they advanced upon the enemy, and the rout, beginning at the center, became complete. Right? The center collapses, and so the Vandal wings. We're not really told what happens from the Vandal side. This is sort of frustrating because, yeah, that's how sources really are. But they evidently collapse as the center collapsed, and there is not much of a resistance. The thing goes on, says, for each of the Roman divisions turned to flight those before them with no trouble. Right, so the general law, let's say this moral collapse caused by the Tzadzin's death is remarkable. The Massagetae, seeing this according to their agreement among themselves, joined the Roman army in making the pursuit, but this pursuit was not continued for a great distance, for the Vandals entered their own camp quickly and remained quiet, while the Romans, thinking that they would not be able to fight it out with them inside the stockade, stripped much of the corpses as had gold upon them and retired to their own camp. All right. This is also interesting because you see that there is a major collapse, but the Vandals evidently do not have many other places to run away from, so they install themselves behind in this stockade, within this stockade that is not even a camp according to them. So the Byzantines decide to just loot, and probably they realize that it's sort of useless to try to fight these guys out. As we've seen, there hadn't been sort of major commitment, and here, if the Vandals had sort of been broken so easily, they thought that it was over for them, so that as it was really, and in a moral sense, the Romans really had won, and there wasn't. And here we're told of the losses. Procopius says, there perished in this battle of the Romans less than 50, but of the Vandals about 800. Is it plausible? Yeah, if the Vandals collapse in that way, it is plausible. But we also have to understand who were these people. Here again, there is no mention of the Moors. We do not know specifically who did what kind of role the Huns had, if they had maybe at that point, if the whole Roman army advances, for example. Couldn't the Huns from, again, that more detached position carry out, for example, a flank attack? We see also that many Vandals survive, which means that, yes, the Huns begin to chase, but evidently there weren't even too many, right, so that they could chase so extensively, and the Vandals entrenched themselves after all in this stockade. So again, we don't know better in a precise quantitative sense. But we understand, of course, the bit light motive of Procopius' work, that of course the Byzantines had a much higher quality than these Romano-Germanic peoples, and say the conquest of Africa was just, again, pretty swift. Overall, that we can think also very differently from that. Of course, here we can think of how much could be lethal in this battlefield: bows, javelins, but these numbers are plausible. Maybe the Byzantines suffered a bit more losses, but anyway. Procopius goes on, says, but Belisarius, when the infantry came up in the late afternoon, moved as quickly as he could with the whole army and went against the camp of the Vandals. So this is interesting because it shows that the infantry was substantially distant from the rest of the battle line, which also makes you think, because even though, of course, these battles could be quite complex movements, and there is a lot of, again, emphasis on cavalry that can cover certain distances relatively more easily in combat without having to care about, say, logistics in a single day's engagement. The idea is that this infantry was not that supported to begin with, right? It was supportive, but they arrived just after the main engagement had already occurred. and Belisarius uses it, of course, to try to storm the Vandalic camp. Procopius says that Gelimer, realizing that Belisarius with his infantry and the rest of his army was coming against him straight away without saying a word or giving a command, leaped upon his horse and was off in flight on the road leading to Numidia. And his kinsmen and some few of his domestics followed him in utter consternation, and regarding with silence what was taking place. And for some time it escaped the notice of the Vandals that Gelimer had run away, but when they all perceived that he had fled and the enemy were already plainly seen, then indeed the men began to shout, and the children cried out, and the women wailed. And they neither took with them the money they had, nor did they heed the laments of those dearest to them, but every man fled in complete disorder just as he could. And the Romans coming up captured the camp, money and all, with not a man in it, and they pursued the fugitives throughout the whole night, killing all the men upon whom they happened, and making slaves of the women and children. So here essentially, like the Vandal army, yes, can entrench itself into this, the remaining of the Vandal army into this place with all the women and children as well. But of course, it's not much of a, defensive position to begin with, if especially you give the initiative to the enemy that has crushed you and has fresh forces that can arrive. Here again, no mention of the Moors. So people said like there wasn't these forces, or at least Procopius, named them, but they were so irrelevant that we don't even think of them. Actually, I think they were there. He says that, so it's all what we know. Why shouldn't we actually think they were? Then the story goes on, and they found in this camp a quantity of wealth such as has never before been found, at least in one place, where the Vandals had plundered the Roman domain for a long time and had transferred great amounts of money to Libya. And since their land was especially a good one, flourishing abundantly with the most useful crops, it came about that the revenue collected from the commodities produced there was not paid out to any other country in the purchase of a food supply, but those who possessed the land always kept for themselves the income from it for the 95 years during which the Vandals ruled Libya. And from this it resulted that their wealth, amounting to an extraordinary sum, returned once more on that day into the hands of the Romans. So this battle and the pursuit of the capture of the Vandals' camp happened 3 months after the Roman army came to Carthage, at about the middle of the last month, which the Romans call December. So actually there is all the story of how Gelimer gets captured, etc., but this is basically the Battle of Tricamarum. We will look at, the bigger picture on another occasion. What can we say? Not too much. We've seen essentially what this whole situation was about and how things unfolded. We're not told too much, very much. The same names, for example, of the various Byzantine commanders are relatively influent. We do not have even a better understanding of the composition of this army. Even less we can say about the Vandal one. We think that, say again, the general battle may have actually gone like Procopius says, but I can say by experience that had you just another source, you would perceive like a different story. Not say something that went in a radically different way, but still something adding, I don't know, a detail or two, or something that could open your eyes about the probably much more closely fought engagement. And here Procopius does not stress it, but of course the 3 Byzantine attacks in the center, of course, show some important level of action and attrition, and so it's not nothing is really as simple as it seems. This was a closely fought battle. In any case, the Vandals do not show this terrific cohesion. The same battle array is quite simple. They are people who follow their leaders in that sort of constitutively, again, clanic sense. The death here of Gelimer's brother seems to be basically the entire point. It's not even about Gelimer, but about his brother. And consider that in the center there were these, again, Vandal veterans of Sardinia that probably were the ones who took the brunt of the Byzantine attack, and when their leader died, began to flee, and so bring into the collapse of entire army. At this point, we do not even know exactly what Gelimer did, or where he was more specifically, because we're not told, but he was probably there. And if the Moors had been successfully integrated into combat, of course, they could have sort of maybe outpowered the Romans to an extent, but we know too few. Procopius, again, tells about these Moors, but he doesn't tell eventually anything else about their action, other than the fact that they had been arrayed in the sector behind the Vandals. Right? I don't think that can be interpreted in many different ways. The Moors would have provided, again, also with the infantry. It's likely that the Vandals had... this is also an important point. We see that the Byzantine infantry had been left completely behind. The Vandals probably also did fight largely mounted, or at least we can say that this broader force was collected, especially in North Africa. There were good horses, also lighter ones, so even the lighter soldiers would have, say, the poorer soldiers may have been equipped with a horse from the Vandal side. So I think as a whole that can also explain a bit the entire thing. The Vandals do not have such a rigidly hierarchy, say, formalized discipline of military professionalism, in that they had good forces. They were essentially of the same, say, scale of organization and capacities of the Byzantines, but being that and being sort of battle hardened, sort of well led, and sort of more cohesive force depends mostly on some political issues. And here we do not seem, especially after the defeat of Decimum, that was also this great say, Vandal. They retreated, they withdrew, they abandoned Carthage, so that meant something in the general military balance. So, as a whole, this battle does fit pretty much its historical context. It's interesting, it's the first time we talked about say, a battle of the Byzantine Reconquest. This is the first battle that we discuss of the Vandals, and I think possibly of at least the Germanic peoples, because we made a video about the Battle of Mammes that also involves and partially some relics of the Vandals. You know that part of the Vandals were killed, were deported to other frontiers as soldiers. A bit what happened to the Huns that were complaining about that. But actually many were left, especially in the westernmost frontier of the Vandalic kingdom, to stem the Berbers. And in fact we do know that in those areas there is a greater coincidence of blonde and blue eyes in the North African population, as a consequence likely of such Vandalic permanence as settlement. And those were quite useful because the Berbers began to press hard against Byzantine Africa, and actually some even complain about the fact whether this reconquest of the Vandals was so necessary that they could have turned into a vassal kingdom. But at the same time, I think the conquest was good, and at least the local Vandals that had already been settled on the western frontier against the Berbers were simply left there. This is something that the Byzantines did also in Italy with the Ostrogoths in the northeast, and so it does make sense to an extent, because what were these garrisons going to do? They weren't an army as a whole could take the field, these large forces. We know few, of course, about the broader forces that we've seen here numerically, but the numbers sort of do make sense if we think that this was like what the Vandals had left. Here I used 20,000 for the Vandals, but some say 25,000 if you add the Moors. So the idea is that there would be also some sort of extras of poorer quality that we do not really see clearly, mostly because of the fact that we don't know what the Moors were doing or what kind of sort of other force. I mean, how were the Vandal forces segmented, like in terms of like how many rich people were there. I mean, we don't have too much about Vandal Africa, telling the truth. It was too peculiar of a kingdom, sort of swallowed by its own sort of Romanity, as far as the archaeological sources are concerned. And at least we don't have such enormous evidence to just, for many historical reasons, now we can't simply digress, but these areas were conquered by the Arabs. It's a completely different world, right? Compared to, say, I don't know, the Alemanni or the Longobards or whatever. And so we will not know too much about their army organization, but I will make a video about that, because we do know something about it anyway, and we will appreciate also the broader size. And it's perfectly plausible that the Vandals were something 20,000 plus. I don't think they reached 30,000. This is, again, a very exhausted time in history, let's say, in terms of resources, and so it's likely that things were going a bit more, say, again, the forces were a bit more contained. Again, Belisarius' armies themselves were fairly small, considering that they reconquered all this broader, say, world. It's still remarkable how contained they were, but because they were well trained, they were well led. Less is also sort of more easily, say, at parity of resources, sort of better armed, better supplied in general, so that makes it so. We will, however, keep talking again about this this context of the Vandalic Wars and the broader Justinian reconquest. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.